Gabby, thank you so much for joining me today on our very first LinkedIn Live.
Hi, and thank you so much for having me. And thanks to all of you for dialing in.
Yes, we are excited. And right off the bat, this is a big learning experience for us. So, those of you who are in the audience, please let us know what you think about this format. And by all means, we'll be keeping an eye on the chat in real time. So, if you have questions or want to comment on anything, please feel free to do so on whatever medium you're joining us from, whether that's YouTube, LinkedIn. And we look forward to chatting with you today. So I am so excited, Gabby, to have you. I mean, I think as I reflect back, you and I met each other pre-pandemic, so probably about 3 to 4 years ago. Everything's like a blur. So it hadn't been 4 years ago. And what I appreciated so much about you was your ability as a researcher to come in and really ask hard questions. You and I had worked together at Accenture Research for a while, and we really thought, I think at the time, thought we were going to be studying CHROs and really what the modern C-suite looks like. But of course, the pandemic hit, and we had to pivot our research strategy. So it's such a delight for me to think about where we started 4 years ago to where we are today, talking about a completely different topic, but still all in the spirit of future of work. But I know you well, and I'd love for those of you who have not had the chance to work with you or know you yet, would you mind just giving us a brief introduction of who you are? And then one of the questions I'd love to ask is, what are you currently researching? What's top of mind for you as a future of work researcher today?
Sure. So I am Gabby Burlacu. I am based in Portland, Oregon, and I am a research manager at Accenture, which is a professional services company. I have been a workforce researcher my entire career. In fact, I have a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. So that's where my love for all things organizational started. And what we really look at Accenture, my team and I, is first of all, we focus broadly on these incredible macro changes that organizations are facing. When you think about the environment that organizations operate in today, it is berserk when you consider the pandemic and economic shifts and socio-political tensions. Everything happening around organizations impacts the way they operate. And what my team and I do is we really look at the sort of human side of that coin. And we do look at the C suite and our business leaders and what are the mindsets and conceptualizations about work that they hold all the way down to the front line, because where leaders really have a blind spot is what is the experience of their workers. So, really understanding that human side of what organizations are facing today.
I love that so much. And, I think what's so exciting. So, for those of you who don't know, I just recently joined Upwork and we're really excited. Actually, today we came out with a big press release that we are starting an Upwork Research Institute, which very much, Gabby, is in the spirit of what you just said of how do we bring voice to the workforce that's evolving and shifting. And then and in the spirit of how do we help leaders lead in a way and have a greater understanding and hopefully lead with more empathy of what's shifting and what's changing the workforce. So, I love the work that you and Accenture Research are doing in this space. I think you guys are one of the best at studying the future of work. And so I'm really delighted to get your perspectives on Gen Z now in the workforce. But before we get started and share some of the new research I know that I've shared with you, and we'll make sure we share in the chat as well for all those who are listening so you can see our new Upwork research, I want to level set first. We're both researchers. So, what are some watchouts we need to consider? I think, Gabby, as you and I were chatting a little bit earlier today, as an elder millennial myself, I am almost like cringing a bit remembering, 15 years ago now for us, of the millennial research that was coming out and saying that we were entitled and lazy and we didn't really have a work ethic and all of that. So, from your perspective, I know you're an expert in generational research. I know you've done some of your dissertation work on it as well. What would you advise the audience today? What are some watchouts as we consider generational research and, what should we learn from?
Yeah, well, and I love this topic because it's so personal to each of us. We all belong to a generation. And I think we've all had that moment where we heard our generation described and we thought, well, is that really true? Or that's expensive. As a generational researcher, I am very, very strongly on the side of we are more similar than different. So we have to be really careful when we assign differences to generational category. Is it really that we are different people, or is it just that we are living in different times? So whatever that we've grown up with and become accustomed to as normal is really going to influence the values we hold and the way that we communicate those values. So, one of the things I always like to say when we talk about younger generations being more technologically inclined or wanting to be treated as humans, wanting feedback, these are all very, very human things that everybody wants. but previously weren't necessarily in a position to ask for. And so the watch out for me is a lot of the differences that we believe are attributed to generations actually are attributed to something more like career stage, time of coming of age in our careers, and things like that. One thing I love about the Upwork research is that it does focus on Gen Z and some of the different conceptualizations that generations hold. However, I don't think that this research presents that in people are different, therefore we need different interventions and we need to treat people differently. It's more along the lines of look at these attitudes that are emerging in the workforce that are going to continue becoming more and more prevalent as more Gen Zs, more millennials enter the workforce. And I think that's really the right way to look at generational research to understand what does our future workforce think by sort of understanding the mindsets and values of some of the younger generations today.
I love that. And I think that's so important to just think about and remember. And I think, what I'd love to do is start getting into the actual research and findings ourselves and just ground the audience. As we talk about Gen Z, what age range right now are we talking about? Today, Gen Z is between 13 and 27 years old. And I think what's exciting for us as workforce researchers is we actually have this new generation, as Gabby was just describing, informed by events that we'll talk about in a second that we do think are fairly unique to that particular generation. They have certainly shaped all of us who have lived through the last several decades. However, I do think the point of time in which this generation is entering the workforce, there is a unique mindset shift happening, and I do think hopefully we'll see that across multiple generations with time as well. And so as I mentioned, Upwork fielded a study. We looked at over 1,000 different U.S. hiring managers. So they had to make sure that they had some level of hiring responsibility within the organization because we wanted to understand their attitudes and any sort of shifts in behaviors that we see when it comes to autonomy in the workforce, choice, flexibility, their sentiment towards full-time workers versus freelancers versus contractors versus all the different types of ways of working that are out there. And I think, one of the big ones that we'll talk about a little bit too is remote work and just seeing, sentiment differences there. But Gabby, one of the things I love to think about, as we've talked about the future of work, is what is actually different today. I've got this one slide I sometimes share that has these quotes from executive leaders that say, the next generation workforce coming up is really different and we don't know how to lead and manage them. We feel like we have a skills deficit in our workforce and within our organization. We're really concerned about the growing technology that's coming in and augmenting and automating our workforce. And when I do presentations, I ask, well, what year do you think that these sentiments and these anxieties were found? And oftentimes, a lot of times, executives will say to the audience, well, that sounds like our board meeting we just came out of, or that sounds like what we were just talking about today. And the reality was that was in 1960. And so those same concerns and sentiments, I sometimes feel like as a future work researcher, we haven't really quite cracked the code on how to actually solve for some of the various underlying workforce issues today. And so, Gabby, I'd love your perspective, as I'm thinking about what's actually different today for this particular Gen Z workforce. So let's say in the last 5 to 7 years, what has actually changed? And some things that I do think are different, but I'd love your perspective on are Gen AI is pretty different. Having conversational robotic technology, robotic process automation in the workforce, but then actually feel and empowered with this conversational, almost perceived intelligent chatbot, I think is really unique and different in serving us as a co-pilot in ways that obviously we didn't have when we first came to the workforce. The second is the pandemic. And so I do think we've got to figure out how did that actually change the mindset of the upcoming workforce, especially when I think about so many of these workers enter the workforce remotely. So they never had that, yeah, and I say this like a little bit of jest, but like that drink the Kool-Aid moment with their company where they come in and do the big hurrah for onboarding and really understand what the culture is of a company. And so, anyways, what do you think is different today in the future of work, or things that we should be thinking about that are uniquely affecting Gen Z in particular?
So that is spot on. I think technology makes more possible than ever before. I don't know that that is uniquely impacting Gen Z, but I can see that Gen Z, having grown up in a time where that has always been the case and is table stakes, is going to be a little bit of a different learning curve from maybe the baby boomer generation. This is not to say that baby boomers can't learn and become very comfortable with technology. It's just a different mindset. Technology represents something a little bit more new than something that is table stakes. The pandemic, I know we are all sick of talking about the pandemic, but from a workforce research perspective, this is such an incredible inflection point because this is that big moment in everyone's lives in their different career stages that really did change things. And I'll give an example right now that's actually not Gen Z, just to illustrate the way that it changed things for everybody. So, one of the things that we found in our research, the baby boomer population, what they grew up viewing as normal is that really traditional employment contract. I, as an employee, work, you, as my company, pay me, end of relationship. We don't need anything else. We don't need the gym membership. We don't need the culture days. We just need to come to work and do our jobs. And one of the things that we saw in the pandemic, because older workers or older adults rather were at higher risk, was the expectation that companies keep people physically safe and healthy grew tremendously, where suddenly baby boomer attitudes were very much shaped by how physically safe their company's policies were and what their health and safety policies were. And so that's really quite new and really quite a shift that's associated with the pandemic. That traditional employment contract is expanding for them. Now, for Gen Zs, one of the things that we saw that was interesting is especially early career, and again I would attribute this more to career stage than I would generational category. They did want some of that in-person time because I think they didn't have that job security and knowledge to be able to comfortably be off site and do their work at the same rate that they would have done in office. And so that's an interesting space to watch now as well as we think about what is the future of remote work. We do see that younger adults expect to be able to work remotely, but there have been some real drawbacks for that group from that perspective as well.
That's so interesting. And I love how you brought in, like some of the health concerns too that baby boomers were having, but that to your point, that was across the workforce. And so I do think, one of the things that you've talked a lot about before too in the past, just cautioning by over rotating in one particular segment of the workforce, you may be actually missing out on underlying need and value that, we all have as people. And I think that's a really good example. One of the other things that we came up in our research, I'm just be curious to get your perspective on this too, is I think one of the other things that's really new and different today as we think about how we engage in work is the platform economy. So being able to have access to jobs and talent, on both sides of the equation, really from anywhere, and being able to really think about more freelance work or contract work as being really viable career paths. And so I'd be curious to your perspectives, Gabby. Do you think that's again something that we saw in our research that Gen Z was much more likely to adapt? Upwork has, we do every year, this research is called Freelance Forward. We found 39% of Americans were engaged in some level of freelance work last year, but those numbers were even higher for millennials and Gen Z. So any thoughts on, maybe what's driving some of the alternative workforce here or side gigs, anything that you're seeing in your research or your perspectives on? Is this unique to Gen Z or is this something that we're seeing as a broader trend?
Well, I think number one, that it's incredible. I think technology is a huge driver of this. So, having platforms and capabilities to connect skilled workers with organizations that need those skills, that is not something to be taken lightly. I don't think, the newspaper ads of the past would have lended themselves well to this. So, again, from the perspective of a generation sort of being right age at the right time has a lot to do with why we're seeing younger generations really take hold of these opportunities. I also think, and this is true of all generations, because of course we've had economic downturns in the past where I think we're increasingly realizing that even if you do everything right from a career progression perspective, macro trends and things that organizations go through will sometimes impede your ability to do that sort of traditional career growth, right? We're seeing a lot of layoffs, we're seeing a lot of different things happening. And so that understanding that there's no one right way to do things, probably bolstered and facilitated by the fact that we're all better connected and visible than ever before, I think is really driving some of that non-traditional career pursuit as well.
Oh, I love that. I think that's such a great perspective. And I agree. Sometimes when I think about, gosh, how can I even start thinking about my skills? And I think so often we have this perspective, even, as an elder millennial, like you think about, at least again, I'm from Rochester, New York. So I grew up like in the Kodak era and, where you went to work for one company, you got a pension and, I just saw that model, but then I also saw it not work at a very fundamental age
Mhm.
where Rochester lost about 46,000 workers over the course of several years as the economy started to fall. And so I think this relationship of having a skill and then being able to apply it to many we've also seen in research where that actually people are starting to feel more stable and having those sorts of career choices as opposed to putting all of their eggs in one basket. Either way, I think this is such an exciting time to obviously be alive and in researching this space. And so I want to dive into a little bit like more tangibly now of what we saw in the research of what we believe Gen Z in terms of their preferences and their style of what they're actually beginning to demand, I think, a little bit more out of work, for a variety of reasons. And to your point, whether that's because all young people are in a quest to change whatever the systems are of their time, irregardless, here's what we find. Gen Z is looking for choice in their careers. And I think that choice comes in the form of even of how and where they apply their skill sets. And so really having this choice guide a lot of their living decisions as well. When we've seen they've even engaged in less home ownership. We've been a little bit slower to start for a variety of reasons, including some of which are economic. But either way, it's given us much more choice, which then leads to flexibility. And so, like, even me, I think as an elder millennial, I can't imagine taking a job or working for a company that's not empowering some level of flexibility of whether that's location of work, hours, but really just wanting to have that flexibility. The other thing we saw is this like notion of work for purpose. And I think we saw this even like with our generation too when we were coming into the workforce of like, hey, you know what? I think we've got to start doing something good here. Like it's got to be more than just shareholder wealth maximization. I think that served us for a couple of decades, but I think we started to upend that narrative a bit. And I think Gen Z is doing so at an even broader scale, especially as they're going to be facing tremendous climate change considerations and trying to think through again, like how does companies get involved and solve for that? And then the last thing, again, I don't know if this is necessarily new to Gen Z, but what we did see pretty pronounced was skills development. So wanting to make sure as they enter into this workforce during uncertain times, as things are on an economic downturn, as Gen AI is coming into the workforce, how do they make sure that they stay on top of their skills development? So those are just some of the things that we saw that are the fundamentals to getting the equation right for winning the employee experience with Gen Z. But the one trend, Gabby, that I'm really curious to get your perspective on, because I know you have the opportunity to look at thousands of data points and data sets, is remote work. I mean, I still can't believe we're talking about remote work. Here we are this many years later. But I'd love if you're comfortable, like, I'd love for the audience to hear a little bit of the work that you and I had engaged together before about like this notion of being productive anywhere you've talked about and researched a bit, and then just what are your views of remote work and whether it's going to be a long-term trend for Gen Z to be a part of?
I love this question. And yes, one of the things that we were looking at during the pandemic was this idea of should workers come back to office or should they work remotely, and what's the right way to do each? And what we quickly found is that that was such a convoluted question with no easy answers that we then coined this phrase productive anywhere. Forget about enabling work to happen remotely or on site, but think about what are the processes, tools, practices that can help people really be productive, happy, and healthy, regardless of where work physically happens. Um, and this is great for a number of reasons. One, some jobs will never be remote, nor should they. Two, remote work doesn't work for everybody. Remember what I said before about early career people kind of finding remote work a little bit too ambiguous. But as far as what the future holds, it's interesting because I talked about how we look at the sort of mindsets and behaviors of business leaders in the context that we're currently in 2023 and beyond. And this is one of those places where really visibly we're able to see the mindsets of CEOs and business leaders just in the media because we are seeing so much about bringing people back to office, reconnecting them to culture. And I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong. It is a little bit disappointing, right? Because we spent a lot of time during the pandemic researching a different approach. The different approach, not necessarily being that remote work is for everyone, but that you can make these decisions thoughtfully and rooted in data instead of just making a sweeping decision based on opinion. I think we proved that remote work can work at a much larger scale than we ever thought possible. I think remote work now is undeniably part of like our bag of tricks. When we think about being attractive companies for people to work at, remote work is one such benefit, one part of the employee value proposition we can offer up. But I think the real change will happen when business leaders start to see remote work models as potentially beneficial beyond just being an employee benefit, but really a new way of working. And I'm hoping that we move in that direction. I'm a little disappointed by kind of the pendulum swing in the other direction of work happens in a workplace. End of story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think this is one of those things, to your point, it's going to be a combination. I mean, at the end of the day, right, anything that we're studying is just it's an intersection of two trends. So we've got this younger workforce coming in, Gen Z, who has been raised slightly different in a different context, coupled with a pandemic. And that, then again, I would say one more intersection with technology. We have the ability to work remote if we so choose and we adopt our ways of working to enable that. But that is a big human behavior change that we have to get right. And from all the research I've seen here at Upwork and what I've seen across firms, is that this is going to be a key recruiting lever that Gen Z believes is really important to, at least to your point, have the optionality. No, I don't think anyone wants anything forced on them, whether that's forced remote work or forced in the office. It goes back to that choice and flexibility. So I am hopeful that companies who get this right are going to be able to attract the best of the best talent, because we are just seeing this strong correlation in the data. Of course, people who've got the high skills and are in demand are also then demanding from their employers or contract work, having that choice and flexibility built in. So we'll see what happens, but I am certainly going to stay cautiously optimistic. I mean, certainly here we are both remotely joining in and having this conversation. So I certainly hope it's a trend to stay. The last thing I want to talk about, Gabby, just get your perspective on, and I definitely welcome the audience to start putting in questions in the chat. And we'll be able to take a couple today. But one of the findings in our Upward research report, which really was shocking to me, to be fully honest, was this notion of the trusting the quality of work across the workforce. But in particular, we zoomed in to see, was there any sort of trust difference between those who were a freelancer or contractor or not part of that, FTE here in the States, that W-2 employee versus a 1099 contract freelancer. And so, at the end of the day, I mean, my perspective is, as leaders, I want to work for the best with the best talent, and I don't, it doesn't really matter to me what their employment contract is with the company. And I think, if anything, obviously working at Upwork, we're working more and more with a contract workforce and being able to do this at scale, which is so exciting. But when you look at the generational data breakdown, we did see that same level of trust across the different segments of the workforce. So we saw with Gen Z really this like equal, if not more so, trust for those that were coming in and applying their skills through a contract or project based work versus some of the older generations who are just so set on trusting the quality of a full time workforce. So I'm just curious, do you have any reactions to that? Because that one took me a bit off guard, if I'm fully honest. And I do think this might be signaling a very big mindset shift of how we think about work today and what that even means to be an employee or a worker. And I just think there's so much more area that we can go to expand. But what are your thoughts on that finding?
Yes, well, it's a positive and a negative, right? Because things are trending in that direction, right? Gen Z, younger generations are seeing the power of bringing skills and capabilities together, regardless of the formal paperwork behind it, right? The fact that baby boomers have less trust for contract labor and potentially remote labor is an issue, and it's going to be an issue, right? Because trust is so fundamental to teamwork and getting things done. And so I think key to that is going to be, first of all, understanding where the mistrust comes from. Once again, baby boomers have been in the workforce for a very, very long time, and contractors and remote workers are, I don't want to say new, but a fairly new or a smaller proportion of their total working time. So this is an unusual situation to them. Understanding the nature of the mistrust, being able to articulate the value and agility that comes from being able to facilitate and leverage other types of workers. And then also just positive experiences. I think the best thing we can do is facilitate really good, positive, productive experiences between all types of different workers so that everybody can see that this is a good model for work. And it sounds like Gen Z are maybe already there, maybe some of the positive experiences they've already seen or experienced themselves. And so we've just got to make sure that because the workforce is working in these new ways together, that goes well, essentially.
Yes, no, I think that's right. And I think you hit on a key theme too. And again, this is across all generations, but our behavior will not change if we don't lead with the right attitudes and trust, and so again, like one of the questions I'm always asking people is, do you trust your workforce? Because I actually, for me, that will allow me to understand so much about their motivations and their style of leadership and how they're going to behave in this new era of work, just depending on that fundamental question. So I am like super excited that Gen Z seems to be approaching new ways of working with a much more initial trusting mindset than maybe what we've seen in the past. And to your point, because it is new and different, and as we age, I begin to understand a little bit of some of the resistance maybe that we ourselves experienced at the time coming in. Well, Gabby, what a question that came through on the LinkedIn poll. So I ran a poll yesterday and I said, to LinkedIn, what's top of mind right now for as you think about Gen Z? And one of the number one response was changing leadership expectations. So I'd love us just to engage in just a minute or two dialogue here of how we see leadership changing as a result of Gen Z coming into the workforce and maybe some of the new expectations. One of the things I was thinking about is as we kind of go back to remote work is I know even for myself as both a leader but also being led by multiple people is I'm looking for leaders to really have what I call strong remote hygiene. So being able to engage in a remote environment, being able to facilitate team calls. I mean, can you remember the Zoom forced happy hours that occurred when the pandemic hit? Like disaster, not working, right? And so it's like, how do we actually begin to engage the workforce using technology in such a way that's actually makes us excited and engaged with our work, that makes us actually connected with our colleagues? And so I do think the next generation is going to expect that of us. And I don't necessarily know if we've quite cracked that leadership code of what that means and how that actual behavior change is different. I fear too many companies believe that leadership remains the same and just continue to do what you've done and do it now through the medium that we're doing today. But I think there's just something there that's actually fundamentally different, and that we do have to retrain our leaders, especially for those engaging a hybrid workforce. And how do you do that in a way that's not going to be inequitable? So, you've seen some of the headlines too of those that are coming back into the office will get higher performance ratings if some people have gone as far to say. And it's like, that doesn't feel like quite the right leadership behavior. And especially as we think about various populations of our workforce, being able to engage in remote work has actually opened up much more disabled folks being able to enter into the workforce. Minorities who might not feel comfortable or safe in an office culture are now being able to engage in different types of work as a result of this. So I think being able to lead in that environment in an inclusive way and being able to do that in an engaging way through digital medium, I think is going to be a huge expectation shift that the younger generation is going to demand from us that we've got to get right. Anything, not to put you in the spot here, but anything that comes to top of mind for you or anything we should consider as we think about leadership behaviors?
Well, I think you are absolutely right. One of the things we saw in our productive anywhere workforce is that their organizations, rather than simply going hybrid or going remote, also then put into place some changes in terms of how they supported their workers, because it's not just about doing the exact same things in a different medium. The flip side of that is we saw companies trying to monitor their employees while at home, right? Because they thought, well, in an office, we can see what they're doing. So can we virtually see what they're doing at home? And we know that wasn't the right answer either. I think one other thing you said, inclusion, is so key. The wrong way to do this would be to say Gen Z is so different. How do I engage them? Let me attend every webinar I can to try to learn what's in their head, but rather understand that ultimately we're employing people. People, as I mentioned, are more similar than they are different across generations. Everybody wants to be seen, treated with respect, rewarded, and recognized for their work. And I think those inclusive leadership practices are going to become increasingly important, regardless of the modality in which they're delivered.
Yes. I think it's so true. And it's just, as a leader, I am empathetic to the leadership side too, that knowing we've got to figure out within our organizations, how do we create the right capacity to lead in a way that's going to take so much more heart, emotion, transparency. I mean, these things are hard. I think of the Glennon Doyle quote, but like we have to do hard things too in the workplace. And doing this is not going to necessarily come natural in a lot of the ways that our organizations are currently designed. And so I do think there's like huge org redesign work that needs to be done to really think about this from a renewal perspective is one of the words that's kind of top of mind for me is how do we renew our organizations and renew the people within them so we have the capacity to lead, and I think in a way that we'd all be proud of and leave a legacy behind. Well, I know we are at time, Gabby, but I'd love to just end this question. I want to thank those that are coming in the comments too. It's great to see you guys. But Gabby, I was thinking about ourselves. We're not that old, right? Hopefully, but it has been a little bit. We're probably going back, close to 15 years, 16 years from when we first entered the workforce. So as you think about this, and kind of this is as we think about Gen Z, what's one thing you wish you would have taught yourself or knew at 23, 24, entering the workforce, right where our Gen Z emerging leaders are today? What would you go back and tell yourself?
Gosh, well, I think just that non-traditional paths and non-traditional conceptualizations of success in your career are possible. So a lot of my mentors and a lot of the people, early in my career that helped support me and guide me were of an older generation, and it was definitely that traditional career progression model that I, need to go to grad school, need to start at a company, need to work my way up. And again, I mentioned that for all sorts of reasons, you can do all the right things and have that model fall apart a little bit. And so the idea that there's so much out there and so many ways to sort of make your mark on this world that have nothing to do with going from manager to senior manager to director is something I really wish I'd taken more seriously and something I'm opening my mind to every day.
I love that. That's so spot on. Yeah, I think if I think about like where I would, go back to myself too is very much in a similar vein. Is that like you have to know your like the sooner you know your values and what success looks like to you, I think the more effective you can be in your career. And I've got this little note I sit to my desk that when you're in your lane, there's no traffic, and so I think the sooner that you can find your lane and stay there and continue to develop and do skills development. And now using platform economies and being able to apply that across multiple companies, I think is just really exciting. So, um, for those of you, thank you so much for those of you who've tuned in. Hopefully, I've figured out the technology right and figured out how to record. And so, if so, Gabby and I will be providing recording of this event today. I'd love your feedback. Does this work? Does this not work? What could we do better to make this a better experience for those of you in the audience? And I encourage you to go check out Gabby's research on Accenture Research. Follow her on LinkedIn. She is probably one of the best future of work thought leaders in this space. And I'm so humbled, Gabby, that you were able to join me today. And likewise, like I said, I will post on LinkedIn today. We've got a lot of announcements here at Upwork. We're launching our research institute, which we're going to focus on workforce transformation and really figure out how we get this right. We're at this critical point in our, I think, work history, and I hope that we can all end up on the right side of history. So, with that being said, thank you so much. Go check out the Upwork research. Go check out Gabby's research, and hopefully, Gabby, we'll do this again one time.
I hope so. Thanks so much for having me, and
All
thanks so
right,
much to all of you.
take care.
Bye bye.